get the roll call video.
Let's hope that's at the right angle. All right. Can it still see the? Yeah. Okay. So, my name's Alex Denton, and for my persuasive speech, my topic was the combination and effects of video games and the media and violence on popular culture and what people think of video games in general. Now, I actually did all of this research back in my senior year of high school for my internship course, which means I scoured the internet and reliable sources and peer-reviewed sources for anything relating to this topic, and I actually found quite a bit of good information. My main topics when I was looking for questions on what to ask while looking for my sources were: what is the current view of violent video games by the average population? How has the media skewed this view, and what the common population believes of violent video games? Do these violent video games have an effect on physical aggression, and do they have an effect on mental aggression? And these are two very significantly different ideas, simply because mental aggression does not necessarily relate directly to physical human violence. And this will come up very importantly later in the topic. Now, the main points in the media influence on violent video games were mostly specifically designated towards what the media had previously reported on as being caused by violent video games. Specifically, the shootings at Fort Hood and the Aurora, Colorado movie theater, where The Dark Knight Rises was being premiered, along with the slightly older example of Columbine High School, at which two young men shot dozens of people, and the media reported that it was due to the violent video game Doom, which had become popular at the time. These news channels, of course, have the necessity of making news reports more editorialized and fantastical than necessary, simply because their main idea is that they have to bring in ratings, and these news reports have no other choice but to be more editorialized, simply because the more ridiculous they can make them, the more ratings they'll get. And that is one of the main problems with 24-hour news channels such as Fox News or CNBC or CNN, is that they don't have enough news to actually fill up 24 hours. Another important point covered by the media influence is the mental stability of the actual shooters in these cases. Many of them actually did have pre-existing conditions, typically what would be known as high neurosis, which affects someone's ability to differentiate reality and fiction. And one of my sources actually found that highly neurotic people were more likely to be affected by violent video games, simply because they were not able to differentiate between reality, where they did not have the ability to have an outsource for their violence, whereas in the fiction of the video games, they were free to do this with no ill effect on society. Also, what I found was that the societal gender roles in modern society do actually have an effect on what the video games can do to a person. The common societal aspect of hypermasculinity essentially is that which commonly states that males are supposed to be more unemotional and what would be typically known as hardened. For example, they were the first ones to go to war and attempted to keep people of the other gender, or of female gender, away from war, as well as being the kinds of people who are more prone to violence, so as society states. The thing is that there is, in fact, a difference in how males and females are affected by violent video games, but that is only because of the generic societal roles that humans are required by society to adapt to the male and female stereotypes. Age does have an effect, which has been stated by the ESRB, which is the company that actually puts age ratings on video games. And this is simply because at different ages, people are more likely to have different emotional and physical responses to violent stimulus. One of my sources was actually Robert Levant and Kimberly Thomas. This article was published in the Journal of Men's Studies, and it specifically looked at the effects of traditional masculine ideology and how that is affected and affects violent video games and such stimulus in males. Now, they found that in playing violent video games, there was actually an effect on males which desensitized them to the violence, whereas stereotypical females were increased in sensitivity to the violence. This is, of course, affected by the stereotype of males being less emotional and females being more emotional. But what they also found was that males become more physically aggressive, whereas females became more relationally aggressive, which effectively stated that males were more likely to actually lash out, whereas females were more likely to emotionally lash out. One quote from this was that the endorsement of traditional masculinity ideology was significantly and positively correlated with aggression, which essentially means that people who are raised in a stereotypical society in which males were designated to be more physically aggressive, of course, would become more aggressive when shown violent stimuli. One other important thing was that the study itself was actually biased. The study was a survey given to college students who were entirely male, but were predominantly European American, white, middle class, heterosexual, and Christian. And all of these outside variables can actually have an effect on how the study would carry out. And the effects can vary between class, sexuality, location of origin, and religion. And these would all have an effect on how someone would relate to this stimulus. And there's also the probability that this bias was caused by socially desirable responding, such as peer pressure or a person's desire to actually believe what they are told to believe by society. Another important study by Tori Meeks looked into how video games had essentially become a scapegoat for violence in modern society. One thing he said about the Columbine massacre was that overnight, Doom and video games as a whole went from harmless entertainment to the missing link between otherwise well-adjusted suburban youth and acts of inexplicable, horrific violence, which is essentially what many news reports and agencies had said about the two shooters after finding out that they were avid players of the violent video game Doom. And they also, one other thing that was important that he covered was, as stated in a report from the Surgeon General's office, youth violence, a report by the Surgeon General, in 2001, starting in the mid-1990s, overall arrest rates began to decline, returning by 1999 to rates only slightly higher than those in 1983, which essentially states that by the time that video games had become an important part of popular culture, the crime rates had lowered to a point near the beginning of when they became popular culture. And as such, this can essentially state that there is no direct correlation between crime rates and the playing of violent video games. So in summary, to conclude, video games are linked to mental aggression and not necessarily physical violence. Gender does make a difference, but only because of societal pressure to conform to the generic gender roles that our society has stereotyped people into. Crime rates are not affected by violent video games. The media are blamed for fear-mongering for violent video games, and specifically the 24-hour news sites, simply because they are looking for ratings. And that physical violence is typically caused by pre-existing inabilities to differentiate reality and fiction. And this is commonly brought on by mental neurosis or a disability that is not directly affected by the violent video games themselves. That's it.